Welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be focusing on finding the coordinates using the midpoint formula. We're going to show this mastery in class by earning at least an 80% on an exit ticket. Hopefully you have the half sheet of notes in front of you. If you don't, take out a separate sheet of paper. That way at least you can take the notes and we'll get you a fresh one tomorrow. Now, the first thing we want to start out with is our vocab. And vocab is really important in geometry, and so we want to make sure before we start the unit that we have that foundation. A point is going to be a location represented by a dot. There are coordinate points. We're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about midpoints. So it is a location represented by a dot. A line is made up of points and it has no thickness or no width. It can extend forever. It can stop. It doesn't have to do both. It's one or the other. A line segment is part of the line, and the line segment is when the line stops and doesn't continue forever. You have a starting point and you have an ending point. Think about when you're driving to school, whether you're taking the school bus or your parents are driving you. You get in the car, you drive to school. So your starting point is your house, your ending point is school. That is a line segment. That is just a part of the distance you drive in a day or travel in a day. A midpoint is the point on a segment halfway between your endpoints. Think about mid. It's like the middle. The middle of the line segment is your midpoint. It's halfway there, which means both sides are congruent to each other. Your distance is the length between your two endpoints. And instead of saying 2 points, it's going to be 2 endpoints. It's where you stop. When you start, you have your distance. Now, we can find the distance of the whole line segment. We can find the distance of the midpoint. We can find the distance between 2 random points. But it is the length of the segment between 2 endpoints. And our last vocab is congruent. It's having the same measure. If one half is 5, the other half is 5, they are congruent to each other. And that's going to become important when we talk about midpoint. We want both parts to equal each other when we cut them in half at our midpoint. Now, if you need to pause to write any of these down, please feel free to do so. Now, on the back, our midpoint formula, if we want to find the middle, it's like finding the average. So, it's going to be on a coordinate plane, so we need our x and our y. It's going to be your x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and then it's going to be y1 plus y2 divided by 2. And for these, you're always going to be given coordinates. We're finding the coordinates. So you have your x1 and your y1 together, and your x2 and your y2 together. Now, it doesn't matter which order you add them in. I put 1 first because that's the point that comes first. If you added x2 plus x1, that's fine. Just make sure you don't add x and y. We want to make sure we're adding like parts on the coordinate plane. Now, if we look at our first one with the graph, we want to find the midpoint of the 2 points. Well, first of all, we need to figure out what those 2 points are. My bottom point is 1, -4, and my top point is 5, 1. Once we have those, now we can use our midpoint formula. So I'm going to write it just to keep reminding myself. x1, x2 divided by 2, and then y1 plus y2 divided by 2. Well, if I fill in my points, I have 1 plus 5 over 2, and I have -4 plus 1 over 2. Well, 1 plus 5 gives me 6. -4 plus 1 gives me -3. If I simplify it all the way down, I get 3, and I get -1.5. I know when we were in algebra, we didn't typically use decimals. We left them all as fractions. For geometry, we want to make sure we turn it into a decimal so that we can plot those points. Our second problem, a plane is set to take off at the coordinates 371, -525 and land at coordinates 775, 949. The pilot needs to contact air traffic control at the midpoint in his trip. What are the coordinates the pilot needs to notify air traffic control? So again, we have x1 and x2 divided by 2, y1 and y2 divided by 2. Well, this becomes 371 plus 775 over 2, and -525 plus 949 over 2. And it's weird when we talk about planes that we say negative 525, but think of a plane when they're traveling as a coordinate grid. They have to have a starting point on their coordinate grid to know where they're going, so this just means they're going to the left of it. This becomes 1146 over 2 and 424 over 2. So our midpoint is 573 and 212. And that is halfway through the pilot's journey, and that's when he should let air traffic control know. Now, the last type of question you'll see is when you're given an endpoint and a midpoint, and you need to find the other endpoint. We're still going to use the same formula. We still want to focus on x1 plus x2 over 2 and y1 plus y2. Now, the difference is we're going to split this apart now. We have an x1 and we have a y1. This I'm going to call my mid x and my mid y. So if I have x1, I have negative 168 plus x2 over 2, and that's going to equal 110, because that, if I were to simplify that down, that equals my midpoint. On the other side, I have negative 138 plus y2 over 2, and that's going to equal 176. Again, that 176 is just the y coordinate in my midpoint. So now we're going to solve both equations. We're going to solve them separately. Multiply using our algebra, negative 168 plus x2 equals 220. We're going to add 168 to both sides, meaning x2 is going to equal 388. If I solve my y, again, we're still going to use the same algebra techniques. Y2 is going to equal 490. Now, if we look at our coordinates, my second point would be 388, 490, and that's going to be my endpoint. The one thing we have to keep in mind is that it needs to make sense. If I'm starting in the negatives and my midpoint is in the positives, well, that means my other endpoint has to be in the positives. It's not going to be a line that starts at an endpoint, goes to a midpoint, and then goes back to the same endpoint. That's no longer a midpoint. That's just a line segment. So make sure when you solve these that your answers make sense. We don't have to graph it and make sure that it's perfectly in the middle. If your math is correct, it will be perfectly in the middle. But I shouldn't have a negative endpoint, a positive midpoint, and a negative endpoint. We have a negative endpoint, a positive midpoint. We need to keep going in the positive direction to get our other endpoint. Please bring your notes and any questions you have to class tomorrow. I look forward to seeing you then.